Genesis and structure. I must begin with a precaution and a confession. When, in order to approach a philosophy, one is armed not only with a pair of concepts here, structure and genesis, that has been detained or overburdened with reminiscences by a long problematical tradition, but also with a speculative grid in which the classical figure of an antagonism is apparent from the start, then the operative debate which one prepares to undertake from within this philosophy, or on the basis of it, is in danger of appearing to be not so much an attentive scrutiny as a putting into question, that is, an abusive investigation which introduces beforehand what it seeks to find, and does lends to the physiology proper to a body of thought /t. No doubt, to treat a philosophy by introducing the foreign substance of a debate may be efficacious, may surrender or set free the meaning of a latent process, but it begins with an aggression and an infidelity. We must not forget this. In the case at hand, this is truer than ever. Husserl has always indicated his aversion for debate, dilemma, and aporia, that is, for reflection in the alternative mode whereby the philosopher, at the end of his deliberations, seeks to reach a conclusion, that is, to close the question, to enclose his expectations or his concern in an option, a decision, a solution, and this would be the result of a speculative or dialectical attitude, in the sense that Husserl, at least, always sought to ascribe to this word. Not only are the metaphysicians guilty of this attitude, but often, unbeknownst to themselves, so are the adherents of the empirical sciences. Both groups would be congenitally guilty of a certain sin of explicationism. The phenomenologist, on the contrary, is the true positivist who returns to the things themselves, and who is self-effacing before the originality and primordiality of meanings. The process of a faithful comprehension or description, and the continuity of explication must dispel the shadow of a choice. Thus one might say, and in an entirely prejudicial fashion, that Husserl, by his rejection of system and speculative closure, and by virtue of the style of his thought, is attuned to the historicity of meaning and to the possibility of its becoming, and is also already respectful of that which remains open within structure. And even when one comes to think that the opening of the structure is structural, that is, essential, one already has progressed to an order heterogeneous to the first one. The difference between the necessarily closed, minor structure and the structurality of an opening such, perhaps, is the unlocatable site in which philosophy takes root. Particularly when it speaks of and describes structures. Thus, the presumption of a conflict between the genetic approach and the structural approach from the outset appears to be superimposed upon the specificity of what is given to a virgin glance. And if the question structure or genesis had been exposed to Husserl ex abrupto, I wager that he would have been quite astonished to see himself called into such a debate. He would have answered that it depends upon what one intends to speak about. There are some givens which must be described in terms of structure, and others which must be described in terms of genesis. There are layers of meaning which appear as systems, or complexes, or static configurations, within which, moreover, are possible a movement and a genesis which must obey both the legality proper to and the functional significance of the structure under consideration. Other layers, sometimes more profound, sometimes more superficial, are given in the essential mode of creation and movement, that is, in the modes of primordial origin, of becoming, or of tradition, and these require that in speaking of them one use the language of Genesis, supposing that there is one, or that there is only one. The image of this fidelity to the theme of the description can be found in Husserl's, at least apparent, fidelity to himself all along his itinerary. To show this, I will take two examples. The transition from the genetic researches in the only book whose method, or some of whose psychologistic presuppositions, Husserl renounced, I am thinking of Philosophie der Arithmetic, to the Logisch unter Suchen in particular, where above all it was a question of describing the objectivity of ideal objectivities in a certain atemporal fixedness, and in their autonomy as concerns a certain subjective becoming. This transition has an explicative continuity, and Husserl is so sure of this that more than 40 years later he writes, this fixing of attention on the formal, and a first understanding of its meaning, I acquired through my Philosophie der Arithmetic, 1891, which, despite its immaturity as a first text, nonetheless represented a first attempt to attain clarity as to the true meaning, the authentic and original meaning, of the concepts of set theory and number theory, and did so by returning to the spontaneous activities of colligation and numeration in which collections, totalities, sets, and numbers are given in an originally productive way. Therefore it was, to use my later way of expressing myself, a research deriving from constitutive phenomenology. Etc. 1. It will be objected that fidelity is easily explained here, since it is a question of grasping, in the dimension of the transcendental genesis, an intention that was first attached perhaps more nigh.belly but with sure uncertainty to a psychological genesis. But one cannot say the same about the transition within phenomenology, this time from the structural analyses of static constitution practiced in Leigh 1913, to the analyses of genetic constitution which follow, and which are sometimes quite new in their content. And yet this transition is still a simple progress which implies no surpassing, as it is called, and still less an option, and especially not a repentance. It is the deepening of a work which leaves intact what has been uncovered, a work of excavation in which the bearing of both the genetic foundations and the original productivity not only neither shakes nor ruins the superficial structures already unearthed, but also brings eidetic forms once again to light, that is the structural a prioris. This is Husserl's expression of Genesis itself. Thus, in Husserl's mind at least, there was never a structure-genesis problem but only a privilege of one or the other of these two operative concepts, according to the space of description, the quid, or the quomodo of the givens. In this phenomenology, where, at first glance, and if one takes inspiration from traditional schemas, motifs of conflict or of tension appear numerous, it is a philosophy of essences always considered in their objectivity, their intangibility, their a priority, but, by the same token, it is a philosophy of experience of becoming, of the temporal flux of what is lived, which is the ultimate reference. It is also a philosophy in which the notion of transcendental experience designates the very field of reflection. In a project which, in Kant's eyes for example, would have derived from teratology, one finds no clashes, and the mastery of the phenomenologist at work would have assured Husserl of a perfect serenity in the usage of these two always complementary operative concepts. Phenomenology, in the clarity of its intention, would be offended, then, by our preliminary question. Having taken these precautions as concerns Husserl's aims, I must now confess my own. In effect, I would like to attempt to show, first, that beneath the serene use of these concepts is to be found a debate that regulates and gives its rhythm to the progression of the description, that gives to the description its animation, and whose incompleteness, which leaves every major stage of Phenoma 110 logi unbalanced, makes new reductions and explications indefinitely necessary. Second, that this debate, at every instant endangering the very principles of the method, Appears, I say appears, for this is a hypothesis which even if it is not confirmed might permit us, at least, to accentuate the original characteristics of the Husserlian attempt appears thus to force Husserl to transgress the purely descriptive space and transcendental pretension of his research, and to move toward a metaphysics of history in which the solid structure of a telos would permit him to reappropriate, by making it essential and by in some way prescribing its horizon, an untamed genesis which grew to greater and greater expanse, and seemed to accommodate itself less and less to phenomenological a priorism and to transcendental idealism. I will follow alternately the thread of a debate interior to Husserl's thought, and the thread of a combat on the flank of Husserl's field of research into which he had to enter on 2 occasions. I refer to the 2 polemics which placed him in opposition to those philosophies of structure called Diltheism and Gestaltism. Husserl, thus, ceaselessly attempts to reconcile the structuralist demand, which leads to the comprehensive description of a totality, of a form or a function organized according to an internal legality in which elements have meaning only in the solidarity of their correlation or their opposition, with the genetic demand, that is the CSCH for the origin and foundation of the structure. One could show, perhaps, that the phenomenological project itself is born of an initial failure of this attempt. In Philosophie der Arithmetic, the objectivity of a structure, that of numbers and arithmetical series and, correlatively, that of the arithmetical attitude is tied to the concrete genesis which must make it possible. From the start, Husserl refuses, and will always refuse, to accept the intelligibility and normativity of this universal structure as manna fallen from a heavenly plae, topos auranios, to or as an eternal truth created by an infinite reason. To seek out the subjective origin of arithmetical objects and values, here, is to turn back toward perception, toward perceptual ensembles, and toward the pluralities and totalities found in perception in a pre-mathematical organization. By virtue of its style, this return to perception and to acts of colligation or numeration yields to the then frequent temptation vaguely named psychologism 3, but Husserl indicates his reservations on more than one score, and he never reaches the point of construing an actual genetic constitution as an epistemological validation, as Lipps, Wundt, and several others had the tendency to do. Altdug, it is true that read attentively, and for themselves, they would appear more prudent and less simplistic than one would be tempted to believe on the basis of Husserl's criticisms of them. Husserl's originality is to be recognized in that, a. he distinguishes number from concept, that is, from a constructum, a psychological artifact, b. he underlines that mathematical or logical synthesis is irreducible to the order in both senses of the word of psychological temporality, c. he bases his entire psychological analysis on the already given possibility of an objective etwas Überhaupt, which Freya will criticize under the denomination bloodless spectre, Blutlosis Gespenst, but which designates the intentional four-dimension of objectivity, the transcendental relation to the object that no psychological genesis can institute but can only presuppose in its own possibility. Consequently, the respect for arithmetical meaning, for its ideality and its normativity, forbids Husserl any psychological deduction of the number at the very moment when both his stated method and the tendencies of the period should have pushed him toward one. It remains that the intentionality presupposed by the movement of Genesis is still conceived by Husserl as a trait, as a psychological structure of consciousness, like character and the state of something factual. Now, the meaning of the number can do very well without the intentionality of a factual consciousness. This meaning, that is, this ideal objectivity and normativity is precisely independence from any factual consciousness, and Husserl quickly will be obliged to acknowledge the legitimacy of Freya's criticisms. The essence of the number derives from psychology to the same extent as does the existence of the North Sea. Moreover, neither unity nor zero can be engendered on the basis of a multiplicity of positive acts, facts, or psychic events. What is true for arithmetical unity is also true for the unity of every object in general. If Husserl gives up the psychological root 5 when confronted by all the difficulties of accounting for a structure of ideal meaning on the basis of a factual genesis, he no less rejects the logicizing conclusion with which his critics wish to comber him. Whether in the then current Platonic or Kantian style, this logicism was preoccupied above all with the autonomy of logical ideality as concerns all consciousness in general, or all concrete and non-formal consciousness. Husserl, for his part, seeks to maintain simultaneously the normative autonomy of logical or mathematical ideality as concerns all factual consciousness, and its original dependence in relation to a subjectivity in general, but concretely. Thus he had to navigate between the Scylla and Charybdis of logicizing structuralism and psychologistic genetism, even in the subtle and pernicious form of the transcendental psychologism attributed to Kant. He had to open up a new direction of philosophical attention and permit the discovery of a concrete, but non-empirical, intentionality, a transcendental experience which would be constitutive, that is, like all intentionality, simultaneously productive and revelatory, active and passive. The original unity, the common root of activity and passivity is from quite early on the very possibility of meaning for Husserl. And this common root will ceaselessly be experienced as the common root of structure and genesis which is dogmatically presupposed by all the ulterior problematics and dissociations concerning them. Husserl will attempt to prepare an access to this common radically through the diverse reductions, which are presented initially as neutralizations of psychological genesis and even of every factual genesis in general. The first phase of phenomenology, in its style and its objects, is structuralist, because first and foremost it seeks to stay clear of psychologism and historicism. But it is not genetic description in general which is disqualified, but only the genetic description which borrows its schemas from naturalism and causalism, and depends upon a science of facts and therefore on an empiricism, and therefore, concludes Husserl, depends upon a relativism incapable of ensuring its own truth, therefore, on a skepticism. The transition to the phenomenological attitude is made necessary, thus, by the impotence or philosophical fragility of genetism when the latter, by means of a positivism which does not understand itself, believes itself capable of enclosure by a science of facts, Tatsachen-Wissenschaft, whether this be a natural science or a science of the mind. The expression worldly genesis covers the domain of these sciences. For as long as the phenomenological space has not been uncovered, and for as long as the transcendental description has not been undertaken, the problem of structure and genesis seems to have no meaning. Neither the idea of structure, which isolates the different spheres of objective signification with respect for their static originality, nor the idea of genesis, which affects abusive transitions from one region to another, appears adequate to clarify the problem which is already Husserl's, that is, the problem of the foundation of objectivity. This might appear to be inconsequential. Can one not imagine, in effect, a methodological fecundity of these two notions in the various domains of the natural and social sciences to the extent that the latter, in their own movement and moment, in their actual labor, do not have to answer for the meaning and value of their objectivity? Not at all. Even the most naive utilization of the notion of genesis, and especially of the notion of structure, supposes at very least that the natural regions and the domains of objectivity have been rigorously circumscribed. Now, this prior circumscription, this elucidation of the meaning of each regional structure can derive only from a phenomenological critique. The latter is always rightfully primary, because it alone can answer, before every empirical inquiry and in order for such an inquiry to be possible, questions of this kind: what is the physical thing, what is the psychological thing, what is the historical thing, etc., etc. Questions whose answer was more or less dogmatically implied by the structural or genetic techniques. Let us not forget that if Philosophie der Arithmetic is the contemporary of the most ambitious, systematic, and optimistic of psychogenetic attempts, Husserl's first phenomenological works were developed approximately at the same time as the first structuralist projects, or at least those which stated structure as a theme, for it would not be difficult to show that a certain structuralism has always been philosophy's most spontaneous gesture. Now, Husserl states his objections to Diltheism and Gestaltism, those first philosophies of structure, in a way that is identical in principle to his objections to genetism. In Husserl's eyes, the structuralism of the Weltanschauung's philosophy is a historicism. And despite Dilthey's vehement protests, Husserl will persist in thinking that, like all historicism, and despite its originality, the Weltanschauung's philosophy avoids neither relativism nor skepticism. 6. For it reduces the norm to a historical factuality, and it ends by confusing, to speak the language of Leibniz and of the Logisch Untersuchungen, Volume I, p. 188, the truths of fact and the truths of reason. Pure truth or the pretension to pure truth is missed in its meaning as soon as one attempts, as Dilthey does, to account for it from within a determined historical totality, that is, from within a factual totality, a finite totality all of whose manifestations and cultural productions are structurally solidary and coherent, and are all regulated by the same function, by the same finite unity of a total subjectivity. This meaning of truth, or of the pretension to truth, is the requirement of an absolute, infinite omnitemporality and universality, without limits of any kind. The idea of truth, that is the idea of philosophy or of science, is an infinite idea, an idea in the Kantian sense. Every totality, every finite structure is inadequate to it. Now the idea or the project which animates and unifies every determined historical structure, every Weltanschauung, is finite. 7. On the basis of the structural description of a vision of the world one can account for everything except the infinite opening to truth, that is, philosophy. Moreover, it is always something like an opening which will frustrate the structuralist project. What I can never understand, in a structure, is that by means of which it is not closed. If Husserl attacked Diltheism 8 with such violence, it is that he found in Diltheism a seductive attempt, a tempting aberration. Dilthey, in effect, has the merit of protesting against the positivist naturalization of the life of the mind. The act of understanding that he opposes to explication and objectification must be the first and major route to be followed by the sciences of the mind. Husserl thus pays homage to Dilthey, and shows himself quite hospitable to the idea of a principle of understanding or of re-understanding, of reliving, Nachleben, notions simultaneously to be juxtaposed with the notion of Einfühlen, borrowed from Lipps and transformed by Husserl, and with the notion of Reaktivierung, which is the active reliving of the past intention of another mind and the reawakening of a production of meaning. In question here is the very possibility of a science of the mind. Second, to the idea that there exist totalitarian structures endowed with a unity of internal meaning, spiritual organisms in a sense, cultural worlds all of whose functions and manifestations are solidary and to which Weltanschauungen correspond correlatively. Third, to the distinction between physical structures, in which the principle of relationship is external causality, and mental structures, in which the principle of relationship is what Husserl will call motivation. But this renewal is not fundamental, and it only intensifies the historicist menace. History does not cease to be an empirical science of facts because it has reformed its methods and techniques, or because it has substituted a comprehensive structuralism for causalism, atomism, and naturalism, or because it has become more attentive to cultural totalities. Its pretension to founding normativity on a better understood factuality does not become more legitimate, but only increases its powers of philosophical seduction. A confess_I or one of value and existence, and more generally, of all types of realities and all types of idealities is shielded beneath the equivocal category of the _HJ historical. 9. Thus, the theory of the Weltanschauung must revive back or be reduced to the strict limits of its own domain. Its contours are sketched by a certain difference between wisdom and knowledge, and by an ethical indictment and impatience. This irreducible difference is due to an interminable delaying difference of the theoretical foundation. The exigencies of life demand that a practical response be organized on the idea of historical existence, and that this response precede an absolute science whose conclusions it cannot await. The system of this anticipation, the structure of this interrupted response is what Husserl calls Weltanschauung. One might say, with some precautions, that he sees in it the situation and meaning of a provisional morality, 10 whether it be personal or communal. Up to now, we have been interested in the structure genesis problem which first presented itself to Husserl outside the borders of phenomenology. It is the radicalization of the presuppositions of psychology and history that made the transition to the phenomenological attitude necessary. Let us now attempt to catch up with the same problem in the field of phenomenology, keeping in mind Husserl's methodological premises, notably the reduction in its eidetic and transcendental forms. Truthfully, we will see that it cannot be a question of the same problem, but only of a arrgh one august or parallel problem, as Husserl would say, and the meaning of this notion of parallelism, which we will touch upon shortly, presents problems that are not among the least difficult. 1/if the first phase of the phenomenological description and constitutive analyses, a phase of which ideas is the most elaborated trace, is resolutely static and structural in its design, it seems to be so for at least two reasons. A. Reacting against the historicist or psychologistic genetism with which he continues to be at loggerheads, Husserl systematically excludes every genetic preoccupation. 11. The protests made against this attitude perhaps have contaminated and indirectly have determined Husserl's own attitude. Everything occurs as if at this point he considered every genesis as associative, causal, factual, and worldly. B. Concerned above all else with formal ontology and with objectivity in general, Husserl applies himself especially to the articulation between the object in general, whatever its regional appurtenance, and consciousness in general, or region. He defines the forms of self-evidence in general, and thereby seeks to attain the ultimate critical and phenomenological jurisdiction, under which the most ambitious genetic description later will be subsumed. Thus, if Husserl distinguishes between empirical and eidetic structure on the one hand, and between empirical and eidetic transcendental structure on The other, at this time he has not yet taken the same step as concerns genesis. Within the pure transcendentality of consciousness, at this phase of the description, our problem would take on at least since we must choose two forms. And in both cases, it is a question of closure or of opening. Differing from mathematical essences, the essences of pure consciousness are not, and in principle cannot be, exact. The difference between exactitude and rigor recognized by Husserl is well known. An eidetic descriptive science, such as phenomenology, may be rigorous, but it is necessarily inexact. I would rather say inexact due to no failure on its part. Exactitude is always a product derived from an operation of idealization and of transition to the limit, which can only concern an abstract moment, an abstract eidetic element, spatiality, for example, of a thing materially determined as an objective body, setting aside, precisely, the other eidetic elements of a body in general. This is why geometry is a material and abstract science. 12. It follows that a geometry of experience, a mathematics of phenomena, is impossible. This is an attempt doomed to miscarry. 13. This means in particular, for what concerns us here, that the essences of consciousness, and therefore the essences / of phenomena in general, cannot belong to a structure or multiplicity of the mathematical type. Now what is it that characterizes such a multiplicity for Husserl, and at this time? In a word, the possibility of closure. 14. Here, we cannot enter into the intra-mathematical difficulties always raised by this Husserlian conception of mathematical definitude, especially when confronted by certain later developments of axiomatics and by Gödel's discoveries. What Husserl seeks to underline by means of this comparison between an exact and a morphological science, and what we must retain here, is the principled, essential, and structural impossibility of closing a structural phenomenology. It is the infinite opening of what is experienced, which is designated at several moments of Husserlian analysis by reference to an idea in the Kantian sense, that is, the eruption of the infinite into consciousness, which permits the unification of the temporal flux of consciousness just as it unifies the object and the world by anticipation, and despite an irreducible incompleteness. LT is the strange presence of this idea which also permits every transition to the limit and the production of all exactitude. Transcendental intentionality is described in ideas L as an original structure, an archistructure, or structure, with 4 poles and 2 correlations, the noetico-noematic correlation or structure and the morphile correlation or structure. That this complex structure is the structure both of intentionality, that is, the structure of the origin of meanings and of the opening to the light of phenomenality, and that the occlusion of this structure is nonsense itself, is indicated by at least 2 signs, a, noesis and noema. The intentional moments of the structure can be distinguished in that the noema does not belong to immaterial forms, consciousness in a real way. Within consciousness, in general there is an agency which does not really belong to it. This is the difficult but decisive theme of the non-real, real, inclusion of the noema. 15 Noema, which is the objectivity of the object, the meaning, and the as such of the thing for consciousness, is neither the determined thing itself in its untamed existence, whose appearing the noema precisely is, nor is it a properly subjective moment, a really subjective moment, since it is individually given as an object for consciousness. It is neither of the world nor of consciousness, but it is the world or something of the world for consciousness. Doubtless it can rightfully be laid bare only on the basis of intentional consciousness, but it does not borrow from intentional consciousness what metaphorically we might call, by avoiding the realization of consciousness, its material. This real non-appurtenance to any region at all, even to the archi-region, this anarchy of the noema is the root and very possibility of objective ity and of meaning. This irregionality of the noema, the opening to the as such of being and to the determination of the totality of regions in general, cannot be described, stricto sensu and simply, on the basis of a determined regional structure. This is why the transcendental reduction, to the extent that it must remain an eidetic reduction if one is to know what one will continue to speak about, and if one is to avoid empirical or absolute idealism, may appear deceitful, since it does provide access to a determined region, whatever its founding privilege. One might think that once the non-reality of the noema was acknowledged, a conversion of the entire phenomenological method would have followed, as well as an abandonment of transcendental idealism along with the reduction. But would this not have been, then, to condemn oneself to silence, which is always possible, moreover, and in any event to renounce a rigor that only the eidetic transcendental limitation and a certain regionalism can ensure? In any event, the transcendentality of the opening is simultaneously the origin and the undoing, the condition of possibility and a certain impossibility of every structure and of every systematic structuralism. B. While the noema is an intentional and non-real element, the heil is a real but not intentional element of the experienced. It is the sensate, experienced and not real, material of affect before any animation by intentional form.